Thank you. So, okay. Well, good afternoon. We've had quite a wonderful plenary session so far, and it's my pleasure to be here in this session with Judge Johnson, a colleague who I respect a great deal and have worked with very closely related to the initiatives in Nebraska through the eyes of the child, and as well as the court improvement program. So we've worked very hard on our plenary presentation with the main goal being that all of you will go home, or at least the majority of you will go home and do something different, either in the courtroom, the judge or lawyer, or those of you who work with the courtroom after our presentation. So I am going to begin the presentation with just a few PowerPoints related to some of the important science related to having trauma-informed court systems and trauma-informed systems in general, because science is very important. But I'm not going to bore you with science. There are just a few PowerPoints that you can also take back. And then we are going to join each other in conversation related to some very interesting scenarios that Judge Johnson put together to discuss ways that we can think about handling these cases and situations for families with children in a much more trauma-informed fashion. So I don't know what's on the screen. Oh, I see, because we have two things here. We all know some of the many reasons that children become involved in the child welfare system, and this is certainly a room where I don't have to provide a lecture on some of those causes, but it's very important related to issues of cumulative trauma, historical trauma, and intergenerational trauma to think of all the different reasons that children are involved in the child welfare system. Also, as you look at all those different traumas that children might be exposed to, it's very important to think about the fact that you may have a child and family, child and parent coming in the courtroom who've been exposed to more than one of those on several occasions, and very important to have knowledge of that in terms of decisions that are made. So that's one of the reasons we're presenting those different types of traumas on that slide. Now, in addition to all those different traumatic experiences that we just talked about, that we just saw up there, poverty contributes, that's additional trauma, discrimination, separations. And it's very important to bear in mind that when a child comes into a court setting because of abuse and neglect, that child has already suffered not only the trauma of abuse and neglect and any other types of traumas, but has then suffered an additional trauma being separated from the perpetrating parent, because that's the only person that that child has known and come to trust and come to love, even if they haven't protected them the way they are. So we have a child coming in with multiple traumas to begin with. Frequent placements, moving from home to home. Even, I don't have up there, but visitation, while it's obviously very supportive, can also be traumatizing, particularly if the transportation is provided by a different person each time, or there's no consistency in care. School problems, immigration problems, and I'm sure everybody in this audience can add to that list. So what are the effects of trauma on children? And again, I have 3 slides talking about some of the biological, relationship issues related to dysregulation and behavior control, and cognitive skills. And the first slide shows a brain. So on your left side is a normal brain of a 3-year-old child. A scan from a healthy child with a normal head size. However, the image to the right is a 3-year-old that suffered severe neglect, and the brain is smaller and has abnormal cortex development and fewer neuronal connections. So since I'm not a neuroscientist, and I don't think there are any in this room, or there might be, this is what we mean by what happens with brain development in a simpler way. A newborn comes into the world with a certain number of neuronal connections, and by the time they're 2 months old, we see there are many more neuronal connections. At 2 years, there's a whole leaf full of neuronal connections, but how those are pruned and what happens to them as the child grows depends on experience. So it's an interaction between nature, what they come up in with, and nurture. And we're responsible, and we, and a broad we, for that nurture. So children in general come into the world ready to learn, and the environment is what helps them grow and develop in the best possible way. And our job also, intervening with young children, is when they come into the court because of abuse and neglect, they come into the child welfare system because of abuse and neglect, we have a great opportunity to change that course of not only their emotional, social, and cognitive development, but their neuronal development. But the earlier, the better. And one other bit of science that I think most of you know about, and if you don't, it's very important to know about. I know Judge Payne and I were talking about this early, and that is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACEs study, done on over 18,000 people across the lifespan. And what they found, bottom line, trauma exposure and trauma symptoms are associated with a higher number of common health problems as well as mental health problems. So if you look at this little pyramid that comes out of the ACEs study, and you start with adverse childhood experiences, and I already talked about the number of adverse childhood experiences that these young children come into court and the child welfare system having already experienced. What you see as they get a little bit older is impairment in their cognitive development, social development, and emotional development. They start to have school problems. They start to get into fights. They can't concentrate. They get into trouble in school. And then as they get a little bit older, and you know about it very well, even better than I do, the health risk behaviors, substance abuse. They get into violent activity, they get into criminal activity, and that's built on that pyramid. It also leads to disease, disability, and social problems and early death. There's the number of adverse early childhood experiences related to heart conditions, cancer, diabetes, obesity, and other risk behaviors. And this is just a chart that I'm glad to share with you. So you have a combination of the early trauma, abuse and neglect, household dysfunction, leading to the impact on child development in many different areas, ability to learn, ability to function, health risk behaviors, and you can see the long-term outcomes. I guess I left out the mental health outcome as a mental health person, increased depression, increased psychiatric problems as well. And it's very important to recognize this, and the research is well respected, and we actually are incorporating in some work we're doing right now in prevention related to primary care, because we don't pay enough attention to early traumatic experiences and what we can do to make a difference. So I am now going to turn the podium over to Judge Johnson, who is going to talk with us about the importance of developing trauma-informed systems, which we have defined right here. Judge Michael Howard and Dr. Frank Putnam have defined this for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Judge Johnson is going to elaborate on it, and then we are going to put it in the context of situations with children and families that one might see, or that people do see, and all of you do see in juvenile court every day. Judge Johnson?
So when Joy asked me how many people would be here, I said, everybody, because they care. And as you know, Dr. Osofsky is a wonderful leader throughout the country and internationally on this, and I am just so delighted that she's with us. So this slide, if you think about it, if each one of us in our respective role, and it's not about the judge, it's not about the prosecutor, parents' defense, guardian ad litem, CASA, foster care review board, the caseworkers, etc. It's always and only about the children and families we serve. And that cuts across everything and ought to cut across every turf war there is, if we can always attend to that common value. So if we build ourselves up as we are with this training and a number of breakouts after this about these topics, and we're ready to go, we want to make sure then that we pass this on to members who can't be here in our court community systems. And it's kind of like the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. That's secondary trauma once we receive these families into the system, that we do no harm as we try to respond with appropriate, reasonable efforts and services. So, how about if we see about applying some of these things? Now, this is a permanency planning hearing, which you're all familiar with from our code 431312, and I'm sure you all have. 12 months or sooner in every case from the date of care, entry to care. And Nick is 4.5 years old. Mom has a drug problem, domestic violence problem, and it's at the hands of the boyfriend right now. The matter was adjudicated, services were offered. We've come together now 12 months later, and what we find is Mom has not done well with services at all. And as you know, the question is, do we offer further time to get better? And on top of all that, she only sporadically and inconsistently spends time and wants to see her son Nick. But she's had some clean UAs somehow in recent times. Now Nick, shows what he's been living with Mom and in care. Angry outbursts at school. He wonders where in the heck his mom is and why she doesn't care enough to want to come see him. You know, he's hard to put to bed at night. He's fitful, he cries. He's agitated most of the time, upset very easily, and I think, as Dr. Osofsky and Dr. Hald and you other clinicians would say, he has dysregulation. So, these might be some questions we want to ask Dr. Osofsky about a trauma-informed court. And when we use that term court, it is not just the judges. Again, it's all of us with our expertise that we bring in all the myriad of ways that are represented by these teams throughout our state. So, Doc?
Well, one of the things that was interesting when Chuck Johnson presented this scenario, we've been working on this a while, I thought about all the questions that needed to be asked, aside from dealing with issues of safety, in terms of the reasonable efforts, if you'll let me use the legal term, decisions that people have to make. So Nick is having trouble controlling his behavior. You have to wonder what might be contributing to that. Nick has been separated from his mother. She was exposed to him, did not protect him from domestic violence. Not blaming, that's just the reality of the situation. I mean, the boyfriend was on the scene. She was also using substances, so we assume that she was somewhat neglectful because most parents who use substances are not with it all of the time. So he's been exposed to domestic violence and neglect. The chances are he's also been exposed to abuse because of the co-occurrence of domestic violence and child abuse. We don't know that for sure. The question is, has anybody talked to Nick? Does anybody know why he's been taken from his mother and placed in foster care? Has anybody talked to the foster parent about what to expect from Nick, considering the violence he's already been exposed to? And we don't even know the experience. He's 4.5 years old. We don't even know the experiences in the early part of his life. One of the things that's recommended for trauma-informed systems of care, including court system, is to do a trauma screen of some sort. Now, people might say it's one more piece of paper and one more record to keep. There are quite simple trauma screens that could be done that can be very informative, or even just a few questions. But the point is that in making the decisions, both the parent and the child need to be attended to, and also the role that trauma may have played in his life. One of the things that we find very often, because I work a lot with, we work with these families, but we also do a lot of training, and I know this has come up with cases in Nebraska as well, and other places, is the child, we don't really know the route that the child takes. So in order to make the reasonable effort decisions, we need to think about what's going on with the child. We also need to think about what's going on in the relationship. So various orders are going to be made by the court. We know this mom has not been compliant. But along the way, one of the things that we've done in many of these court settings is do relationship-based treatment with the mother and the child, at least during a time period where the parent will be compliant with the drug treatment, which makes an enormous difference because this may be a relationship that hasn't developed over time. Now, one of the things I'm listening to myself as I'm talking, and I'm thinking people might be saying, this is going to make things much more complicated because you have to have trauma-informed judges, you have to have trauma-informed GALs, you have to have trauma-informed child welfare, and you have to have trauma-informed mental health people, and frankly, I don't know where all that training is done. We know that it's available in some places, but there actually is an effort now to actually have more social workers trained in their schooling to be trauma-informed. But these are some of the kinds of issues that would come up. And we're actually interested, I don't know if the audience is too big to open it up, but whether this could be helpful in a setting. We know it's helpful to the parent and child, or seems more complicated to bring all this into the mix.
So just when you think you get your arms around a case, what happens? Changes. Of course it does. So we'll add some more facts. Nick's dad's coming back from Afghanistan from deployment. He's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, hasn't seen his son for years. We're going to try to reintroduce the two. Nick doesn't even remember him, but he's anxious. I mean, have you ever had a kid not want to have a parent when they hear about them come in from the field somewhere, and maybe it's idealistic and it's unrealistic, but most of these kids want a parent, and so does Nick. So at this permanency planning hearing, the department recommends reunification with dad, that a custody action be instituted so dad will have custody. What do you think about that? How fast is that going to happen? Have you worked with any military folks with post-traumatic stress disorder? Is it ever just post-traumatic stress disorder? How do they help themselves with that problem? Marijuana, right? Drugs and things, unfortunately, sometimes. So maybe we don't know what all we're dealing with when we talk about timely reunification with dad, but he's on his way back. So we might want to talk with our clinicians to prepare for true permanency, other than just identifying a hope that this will work out with dad.
All right, Nick needs a father. His father's back. The other thing that goes on with post-traumatic stress disorder that we've seen with some of our work with military, and I have a great deal of respect for military, the commitment to the country and everything they do for us. The issues of deployment and multiple deployment has taken its toll. And if a service member comes back with post-traumatic stress disorder, not only are they struggling with their own issues, but they can be very reactive. So if we think about a child running around the house, making noise suddenly, moving suddenly, how difficult that's going to be. So how can we meet Nick's needs in this situation? First of all, is the father receiving treatment for his post-traumatic stress disorder? And I'm not talking about just going in and getting medication. I'm talking about being able to work through the trauma. Also, a permanency plan with a father just coming back from deployment, diagnosed with PTSD, a child who's been through separation and loss, needs to deal with the relationship between the two of them. That needs to definitely be part of the permanency plan. So help and support for the father and support for the relationship. Also, the father's been gone for a number of years, and if we think about it through the eyes of the child, which we need to, we don't really know how long this father's gone, but if you think about a year in a young child's life, it's a very long time. And also, the father who left to go to Afghanistan is a different father than the father who came back, and the expectations and all of that. So all of that has to be dealt with. The father's capacity for parenting, just because he's a parent, and he certainly deserves to be a parent to his son, he needs support with parenting. And some of that needs to take into account understanding, a lot of it needs to take the developmental needs of a 4.5-year-old, particularly a 4.5-year-old who's gone through so much traumatic experience itself. So we need relationship-based work and treatment with the father and son. Maybe there are also other considerations that are going on. You also have to think about the support network for the family. So the mother's out of the picture, but of course she had a boyfriend while dad was away, so we don't know what that relationship was like. But is there extended family? Is there community support? Might there be, if he's still active military, support in the military does get family support and other types of things. So for this to work, you can make a decision to place the child with his father, and that seems like a reasonable decision, but it really needs to come with understanding of the trauma that both of them have been exposed to be successful. Otherwise, they may get back in your courtroom for other reasons.
All right, so secondary trauma. Through the system's policies, procedures, or the way we just deal with files and not persons, this can happen, even inadvertently. Multiple placements rip kids up. We have probation here, which is really great, and we need to expand the fact that we have duly adjudicated youth who are in child welfare and in the juvenile justice system, and there is a lot of trauma going on by the very fact of detention, being brought to court in cuffs, some of the youngest kids, seeing parents be cuffed in front of the children, irregular and unplanned family time, multiple caseworkers, foster care that is not prepared to deal with the needs of these particular sorts of kids, and we just kind of place them there. And so our efforts then are not reasonable unless it truly is a reasonable effort to achieve permanency and to deal with all these sorts of issues. So, do you think we're doing okay so far? Well, let's add some more facts. Dad has custody. The prosecutor moves to relieve the department and terminate jurisdiction with regard to the mom. Does that happen much? How about a show of hands? Happens all the time in our court. Give the child to one parent, terminate on the other. True? Does this have the implications, Dr. Osofsky?
Absolutely. So, if a decision is made, first of all, it sounds like the mother is having difficulty being compliant with her substance abuse treatment. However, we talked about the fact that we haven't done relationship work previously. It sounds like working on with the mother and child together that might have been helpful for her. There's probably not much of a relationship between the mother and the child, but have we done everything we could do before terminating parental rights for that mother? I think that has to be a consideration, and I'm not suggesting a child languishing in care, because we're the ones who are promoting having permanency as quickly as possible. However, being trauma-informed, we have to wonder, is this decision in terms of terminating the mother's parental rights and placing Nick with father going to lead to permanency for Nick, considering all the risk factors involved, or should we be dealing with the complexity of this situation and be just a little bit slower before deciding on the permanency decision because it might possibly be disrupted? The other issue is What happens to Nick if it doesn't work with Dad? Should we be considering that beforehand? Considering that he's already had lots of losses and changes in placement in his life. That's just something to think about. Again, it goes against our push, always mental health push, to have permanency as quickly as possible, but this is a situation that may have uncertainties to it. And in fact, in this case, at least the case that we've constructed, it did, and here's part 4.
So if at the permanency planning hearing, the court finds that further reasonable efforts are not required, what's supposed to happen? Within 30 days. The prosecution is supposed to file a termination of parental rights unless there's a compelling reason not to. If the child's with another relative, is that our compelling reason? And if so, are you satisfied? You look all satisfied. No? Lynette Boyle's not satisfied.
And I apologize for you, I need some things clarified, because you guys are stressing me out.
Lynette's getting stressed.
I'm getting stressed.
Could we do this? We are tight for time. Could you mention one thing that is causing you undue stress?
Yeah, we have an uncharged father that's being treated as if he's unfit to take care of his child.
Okay.
Simply because he came back from the military with PTSD, and so that's stressing me out.
So normally what we've been doing is voluntary services for parents who want to do them and try to keep them out of the system. We'll say perhaps he intervened and said, gee, I'd like a little help with these things. We'll just say he's a volunteer. How about that? I'm going in a little bit different direction with this, but we've got some breakouts on this and we can talk further. But what I'm after at this one is permanency. And are we doing the right things to achieve permanency for this 4.5-year-old who's been in the system? So I would ask you to consider this. One day Dad's jogging, sees a pretty girl, steps into the street and encounters a Mack truck. He's dead now. It happens. What happens to Nick if we terminated jurisdiction only on Mom and closed our case? Oh, I'm hearing murmurs now. This is good. You're digesting your lunch. Is that the deal? I'll give it to Joy.
Well, I panicked when I saw this part of the case, to tell you the truth. You're mentioning your stress because this child has been through so much trauma. I consult on a number of, in a number of different places and hear a lot about different cases, and this reminded me actually of one in another state where there were just multiple losses in the child's life. And a little child at that point has relatively little capacity if he hasn't learned to trust early on. He's already 4 or 5 years old. His behavior is dysregulated. I'm sure he's getting in trouble in school. And what's going to help him get on a path that he doesn't end up in one of your juvenile courts as well? And so the issue that Judge Johnson and I are raising is to be able to take into account the multiple losses this child has experienced so that there's some kind of backup along the way. Because we really don't always look into that and can't always look into that, but that actually would be something that would make a big difference for Nick. Because both the father needed support and Nick needed support so that there was some kind of continuum. We don't know anything about the foster family where he was placed, whether it potentially was a foster to adopt family, or at least, there are directions that many of you know where foster families stay in touch with families after there's reunification, so there's more continuity for the child as well. So it's a situation that makes us as mental health people extremely nervous when there's such a pattern of so much loss.
How about this? Mom comes in for a pre-hearing conference prior to the protective custody hearing, and the petition alleges prostitution, use of drugs, domestic violence with the pimp, and her kids are ages 4 and 6, and they've been put into protective custody. And the judge walks in to introduce the pre-hearing conference, and this is what he sees. Mom's eyes are black and blue. Her face has a large black and blue bruise and blood on the side of her face. The jaw appears to be broken. And as the judge looks around, everybody else is ready to proceed. Is this a trauma-informed court? I won't tell you which jurisdiction this happened in, or which court. Mine. I was shocked. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. And I wonder if everybody was just so shocked too and afraid they didn't know what to do. But it appeared to me it was going to be, let's call it up. And so I said, hold everything. Have you had any medical care? No. And she could barely talk. I said, now she's being brought to the hospital for care. I want somebody to find out how these kids are doing, what they saw, what they experienced, what they know. And then we'll come back when she's healthy enough for this. And if she gets out of the hospital, we've got to have domestic violence protection order. We've got to have safe shelter. We need to get her one of those accredited DV cell phones so she'd have a way to get help and support services in every way. It was the best I could do on day one, but I was in shock when this person came to court. And so I shared this with Dr. Osofsky, and she has a clinician's view of this. I'm just giving you my side. It's walking into my courtroom thinking, wow, I can't believe this just happened.
Well, actually, when I read about this, when we did it over email and then we talked and I read about this, then I thought, I wonder what Judge Johnson's going to do here. And I predicted exactly what he did. But I was thinking about what the judges I work with would do under this circumstance, which were very similar. I can see them taking approaches with various degrees of annoyance or anger, not that judges necessarily show that, but suggesting we have a recess and they come into chambers and discuss this issue. But obviously the medical issues have to be dealt with, but there are a huge number of psychological issues for this mother before we even get to the children, which we have to deal with. What's her trauma history? And if you get her medical care and get her in a safe place and help her get in a safe place, is she going to be able to leave what she's doing? Why is she prostituting? Very short of money. She's a substance user as well. So there are a whole lot of issues, but in order to get to them, her trauma history is very, very important. We have actually seen quite a number of cases that come to us through the court where the parent has been prostituting and a substance user, and they work with us. We work with them in a relationship that the child is very healing for them, and then after about 6 or 8 months, they get short of money, and they say, "Oh, I'm taking a job," and we inquire as to what kind of a job, and it's very hard very often to break those cycles without dealing with a lot of the trauma issues that have led to them in the first place. The other thing is that the children, I would have a big alarm at this point related to the children. What in the world have they been exposed to? They're 4 years old and 6 years old. They witnessed prostitution, if they witnessed domestic violence, whatever other kinds of trauma, what kind of living situation are they in? And also, what do they understand? You have to also have an awareness of the cognitive capacity. They could be delayed, but there has to be some conversation with them about everything that's going on. People find it very difficult to talk to children about trauma. We've been called in situations where they witness a homicide and nobody's talked to them because people don't know what to say to children. So being trauma-informed is making sure that there are clinicians and other support people who are trauma-informed and know ways to be able to support children and deal with that, because they obviously need you have to figure out where they are cognitively, emotionally, socially, and what's going on in their behavior. Get them in a safe place and help get this woman in a safe place, and then move on to see what can be done related to reasonable efforts.
Okay, one last case for your consideration before break. We start another protective custody hearing, and of course the judge goes through the possible disposition rights advisory, and the petition has allegations of, like most of our cases, 85%, mental health, substance abuse, baby tests positive, lack of housing, lack of support, lack of income, and so forth, transportation. When she's at the hospital for the delivery of this child, she says all those things. I don't have anything. I don't have any wherewithal to provide for my baby. And they also notice that she doesn't have any affect. And when we're in court, we ask, do you understand your rights? Do you understand possible dispositions? She really doesn't say anything. And she looks away, seems really sad and uninterested. And even at the hospital, the nurses had to really prompt her to provide some hands-on care for her child because she just didn't seem concerned. So, the court orders supervised family time. The child goes into foster care for safety. Matter set for pretrial, and the hearing's less than 15 minutes. Is this a trauma-informed response to this baby or this mom?
In this circumstance, it would be obviously very important for the judge to have a team to rely on here. This mother obviously needs a psychiatric and a psychological evaluation. Are we dealing with co-occurring mental health and substance abuse disorder? We don't know that. Are we dealing with postpartum depression? Why is there no affect at all? And the only way to learn that is to do a trauma-focused evaluation and a psychiatric evaluation. I saw some nodding related to that. So that's something that the court definitely needs for this mother. I actually have seen substance abusing moms in recovery who had to give up a number of children who, if relationship-based work is started very early, you have a newborn at this point very early, and her mental health and substance abuse issues are addressed in some way with supportive work and whatever else is needed, and relationship-based work with the baby. I have actually seen them being able to be aided in their recovery through their relationship with the baby. But you can't necessarily do it separately. Obviously, you need to keep the baby safe, and the baby needs to be in a stimulating environment. But if this mother is willing and motivated and also doesn't have a mental disorder that gets in the way of relating to the baby, at least that's one direction to potentially go. When I read this case, it was a red flag for postpartum depression, aside from what else is going on. In this case, after one does an evaluation and determines if this mother is motivated and willing and what the whole circumstance is to work together with the baby, it might be an opportunity to do that, but at the same time, we always say babies can't wait. And here you have a newborn who really needs to be in a permanent stimulating environment as soon as possible. So it's not that there's a clear answer, but those are some of the issues that need to be addressed. And the court really needs help from mental health people as well as others to be able to make the best decision in this case.
So since 1980, with the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act, Congress gave the judges the responsibility to keep other branches of government in check as to whether the evidence really shows it's contrary to the safety, well-being of the child to be at home. And were reasonable efforts offered to keep that child at home, and what did they look like? Were they really there, timely? The right services for the right issue. And if we have to do the removal, then reasonable efforts to allow for reunification. And then that for the last 14 years with the Adoption and Safe Families Act, we have an additional reasonable efforts finding that Congress put on the courts. And that is whether reasonable efforts were offered to achieve permanency. So we all got to pay attention and be trauma informed as we do this. And when you find a person like this last case scenario, I know Dr. Joy Osofsky has said this, and Dr. Mark Hall and others, but there is a difference between the inability to comply with court-ordered services and unwillingness. And I would think until there's been some clinical progress, this sort of person is going to need a lot of help. And I'm not saying create a codependent relationship, but this woman needs a safe harbor to get started and consistent services, ideally gender specific. And maybe we might be able to see some daylight occur. But if we respond business as usual without paying very close attention to these facts that affect her and her child, we're missing the boat. And we're missing an opportunity to really do great things for that family. So there's going to be other opportunities with Dr. Osofsky for trauma-informed breakout sessions, and there will be some sessions on domestic violence, infants and toddlers and the like. But we wanted to go through a few of these things that we see occurring through all the country and we know occurring in our state too. I think, Kelly, we have a 15-minute break. Is this true? 15-minute break. I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to also thank you for being here.